Good morning, everyone. My name is Nina Murray, and I'm Head of Policy and Research at the European Network on Statelessness. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of ENS to this webinar on birth registration and the prevention of statelessness in Europe. For those of you not familiar with ENS, we are a civil society alliance of over 150 organisations and individual experts working to address statelessness in over 40 countries around Europe. And we do this through law and policy development, awareness raising and capacity building. We're very excited, not to mention a little bit nervous, to have had an incredible amount of interest in this webinar. We had over 500 people register to participate today, and I can see that there are already over 200 people with us right now, joining us from all over the world. Lots of hellos and welcomes coming through on the chat. I can see people joining us from all corners of Europe, from Poland, from Croatia, from Spain, and I know that we also had some colleagues from other parts of the world registered to attend as well, so welcome to you all. We have people from a range of different backgrounds, from NGOs, from parliamentarians, European institutions, UN agencies, civil society organisations, and people affected by statelessness directly. So it's fantastic to have you all with us. You will have seen our polls. Our poll results tell us that you're working in a range of different capacities on the issues that we'll be discussing today. So we're excited to see people working on advocacy, legal advice, service delivery, research, and here are the results coming through on your screens now. And you can see that we have quite a few lawyers and advice providers, some national authorities, regional institutions, researchers. So it's great to see a range of different people on the webinar today. And we hope that you liked our trick question, which I think you will have seen already, about the international frameworks. Of course, all of those international frameworks mention the right to birth registration, but more on that later. I might have just given you the answer before you got the poll. So in these challenging times, it's really inspiring to see so many of you take an interest in this issue and to take time out of your busy days to learn more about birth registration and preventing children from growing up without a nationality. And we hope that you will stay engaged on these issues in our work beyond today's webinar. So let me tell you a bit more about the webinar and the fantastic lineup of speakers that we have for you today. But first, I'm just going to take you through a bit of housekeeping or logistics. So we are recording the session today. We will make it available afterwards, along with the slides and the resources, and we'll send this to you all by email. The names of participants and the chat is not visible on the recording, so that's just so that you know. Participant microphones and cameras are switched off, so you won't be able to use your mics or cameras. That's just for the speakers. So please use the chat function. I can see you already are. Colleagues are monitoring the chat, and we will collate questions to speakers during the session, and I will put them to speakers at the end during our Q&A at the end. And also feel free to ask us any questions by email or contact us afterwards with feedback or comments. So the purpose of today's webinar is to discuss a new briefing that we have published this week, and hopefully you will have seen it, on birth registration and the prevention of statelessness in Europe. And the briefing is the first in a series of thematic briefings drawing on the data from our Statelessness Index, which you can see on the slide now. And the Statelessness Index is a comparative tool that assesses 24 countries' performance in terms of how they protect stateless people and what they're doing to prevent and reduce statelessness. And you can find out more at the link on your screens there. So our agenda for today, first of all, after I've finished my introduction, my colleague Khadija is going to outline the main highlights from the briefing for you in just a moment. And then we're delighted to have with us Gábor Gyulai, who is Refugee Programme Director at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee and ENS Trustee and President. And he'll, I'm sure, be well known to many of you, but he will share his expertise on the particularly challenging area of determining the child's nationality and identifying where a child would otherwise be stateless. After that, we'll focus in on the action needed to address remaining barriers to birth registration. And we will give the floor to Saskia Bricmont, MEP, who we're excited to have with us as well. She is co-chair of the Children's Rights Intergroup in the European Parliament, and she's going to provide some insight and expertise on galvanizing action at regional and national level on the issues being discussed. There will be some time for questions after that. So as I said, please get your questions ready and post them in the chat, and then I'll put them to our speakers at the end. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, my colleague Khadija Badri. Khadija can switch her camera on. Khadija is ENS's Advocacy and Engagement Officer. Welcome, Khadija, and leads our work on children's rights. So over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Nina. And yes, I'll be talking to some of the content in our new briefing this morning. First of all, briefly touching on why birth registration is important for preventing statelessness, before briefly looking at how the 24 countries that we have included in the Statelessness Index compare on birth registration, before looking a bit more closely at 4 of the areas that we assess the countries on in the briefing in relation to birth registration. So first of all, what is birth registration and why do we need to be thinking about it in terms of preventing statelessness? So birth registration involves the official recording of a birth in a country's civil registry, and it usually results in the issuance of a birth certificate, which acts as official evidence of that birth registration having happened. And birth registration usually records important details about a person's identity, including the place of birth and the characteristics or details about the parents. And why this is important in establishing a child's right to a nationality is because we usually at birth will acquire our nationality either through the place we were born or through our parents. So having a birth registered is a really important way of helping to secure a child's right to their nationality. So that's why we need to be thinking about birth registration when we're trying to ensure every child has a nationality. So how do the 24 countries in the index compare on birth registration? Well, first of all, if you'd like to know more about how we assess the countries in the index on birth registration, as well as the other themes on the index, you can head to the methodology section of the index website. But just to note that our assessment is intended to be an indicative assessment of countries' law, policy, and practice to help us monitor that for advocacy and policy purposes. So the assessment categories are intentionally broad. And we recognize that it's not an exact science, but they are there to give us an overall overview of how countries are performing on issues related to statelessness. And also just to note that the briefing data includes data from before the COVID-19 pandemic. So very, very recent changes aren't reflected in the briefing. But if you would like to know more about how stateless people are impacted by the pandemic, including issues around access to birth registration, you can visit our policy statement on our website that we published last week. And notwithstanding any of these recent changes, the assessment that's in the briefing is as important as ever as we come out of the pandemic and Europe deals with the fallout. So it's still as important as it was. So looking at the assessment overall of how these countries that we've got on the index perform, we can see that there's a real mixture. So there's some overall positive practice in countries like Portugal and Spain overall, but some countries have somewhat negative practice overall on birth registration. But generally for the majority of countries included in the index, there's a real mixture. So in some of the areas that we assess countries on in birth registration, there's good practice, whereas in other areas for some countries, there are still sticking points or barriers, which is why they have this kind of mixed assessment overall in relation to birth registration. So what do we assess countries on in the index? Well, first of all, we looked at immediate free birth registration. So according to international law, countries should provide that every child has their birth registered immediately, and that should be regardless of the resident status or the documentation of the child or the parents. And around half of the countries in the index demonstrate good practice in this respect. And one good way to demonstrate and ensure that every child has their birth registered immediately is to have a provision in law for flexibility in documentation requirements, which means that parents who aren't able to meet certain documentation requirements for whatever reason can still register the birth of their child. And the Czech Republic is a good example of where this happens, because the usual documentation requirements can be waived in special circumstances, as is the case for refugees and asylum seekers, which means that they're still able to register the birth of their child, even if they can't meet the usual documentation requirements. Unfortunately, a common barrier that we see in accessing immediate free birth registration is that it's made conditional in some countries on the documentation or residence status of the parents. And this means that if parents can't meet the documentation requirements in some countries, then they can't register the birth of their children. And this particularly impacts on refugee and migrant families, so because their documents might have been lost or stolen. And it also disproportionately impacts on Romani and other ethnic minority communities in some countries, because they face intergenerational barriers to accessing documentation and things like anti-Gypsyism. And one country where we see this is in Serbia. So positively in 2012, legislative amendments were made in Serbia to increase access to birth registration, but bylaws continue to remain in national law, which require certain documents in order to enable parents to register the birth of their children. And this means that still today, undocumented mothers in Serbia can't register the birth of their children. And this disproportionately impacts on the Romani community in Serbia. So as well as enabling immediate free birth registration for all children, countries should also provide documentary proof of birth to all children, again, regardless of the resident status or documentation of the child or the parents. And again, around half of countries are demonstrating good practice in the index in this respect. In these countries, children are issued a birth certificate regardless of the resident status or documentation of the parents, and without requiring any further action from the parents. One good example of this is Austria, where all births are required to be registered within 7 days, and it's usually done by a doctor or a midwife. And then the civil registry is obliged to register every single birth that it is notified of, and is also obliged then to provide every child that's registered with a birth certificate. So in this case, every child should receive a certificate in Austria. Unfortunately, we see the same issue here in documentary proof of birth, where there are conditions relating to the documentation or residence status of the parents. And one example of this is in Germany, where if parents can't meet the documentation requirements, then they're issued with, rather than a birth certificate, an extract from the birth registry. And court rulings have shown us that this doesn't have the same evidentiary value as a birth certificate, and can lead to barriers to things like parental entitlements, access to preventative healthcare, and might also prevent a child from being able to acquire a nationality of another country that they're entitled to, because that country might not accept that extract from the birth registry as evidence. And also we see, with regards to documentary proof of birth, that the issuance of birth certificates might require additional action from the parents. So in the cases of Belgium and Norway, for example, parents are required to potentially request the birth certificate from the civil registry in order to receive it. And we also see an issue around non-recognition of same-sex parents, creating barriers to documentary proof of birth in countries where, for example, the country might not accept or recognize a birth certificate issued by another country if it has two same-sex parents on it, or a country might not issue a birth certificate to a child with two same-sex parents, which then creates issues. And we also see barriers to documentary proof of birth for children born in conflict zones or territorial disputes, as we see in places like Ukraine. A third area that we look at in the briefing and in the index in relation to birth registration is whether there are mandatory reporting requirements that might deter people from accessing health or civil registration services. So positively, 2/3 of the countries included in the index don't have mandatory reporting requirements of public officials to report people with irregular status to the immigration authorities, and they don't allow it to happen in practice as far as we're aware. but very few countries actually have firewalls or laws in place that explicitly prohibit it in law. One good example of this is Switzerland, where there is an instruction to the Civil Registry Ordinance that explicitly prohibits public officials from reporting irregular migrants when they're registering the births of their children. So that's a really good way to make sure that migrants can register the births of their children without fear of repercussion. One of the barriers that we see, and unfortunately we have to say that there are some countries that do have these reporting requirements in law. So Belgium and Germany, for example, require civil registry officials to report irregular migrants to the authorities. And in the UK, it's actually health officials who are required to do this. And that combined with fee charging for undocumented migrants in the UK might combine to prevent people from accessing healthcare, giving birth in hospital, and potentially then registering the birth of their child. And in a couple of countries, so Bulgaria and North Macedonia, where even though there isn't this requirement in law, we're still seeing reports of it actually happening in practice, even where public officials don't have to do it. So a fourth area, finally, before I hand back over, that we look at in the briefing is access to late birth registration. And even though most countries will have national deadlines by which parents are required to register the births of their children, despite those deadlines, countries should still provide for children to be able to have their births registered in a prompt way and for free. And unfortunately, we see less than half of the countries included in the index actually provide for this and don't have any additional barriers to registering the birth of a child after the deadline. So these countries that demonstrate good practice don't provide it for any fines or penalties for late registration. Countries such as Poland allow for explicit safeguards in law, which allow for ex officio registration of a child if the parents haven't registered the child for whatever reason. And in some countries, we see initiatives to implement automatic registration by health officials to prevent any child not being registered. And in Spain, we see good practice in relation to access to late birth registration. So in Spain, there are national deadlines for registration, but there are no barriers or reasons why a child shouldn't be able to have their birth registered after that deadline has passed. So there's nothing in the way of a birth then being able to be registered after the deadline, which is what we want to be seeing. Unfortunately, some countries do charge fees to register a birth after the national deadline's passed. So for example, in Cyprus, if more than 3 months has passed since the child's birth, then there's a charge of 150 euros. For some of the countries where there are fees, it's not so clear whether or not they are actually implemented or whether they're just there as a kind of preventative measure. But we also see additional requirements in some countries where there might be additional documentation required, or we also see court or administrative procedures being required in order to register a birth after the deadline, which are often lengthy and again require additional things from the parents, which might put them off from initiating a procedure. So before I pass over to Gábor, who's going to look at another area that we cover in the briefing, just to summarize and say that clearly there is good practice that we need to recognize and kind of celebrate in relation to birth registration, but there are still barriers that we need to address, and Nina's going to talk about how we can do that. And hopefully the good practice and the content in the briefing can help us to address and provide examples of how to address those barriers. So if you have any questions about the briefing, we're happy to answer those, and I'll
Thank you very much, Khadija. That was a really comprehensive and useful overview of the briefing. And just to remind you that you can access the briefing on the Index website, on our website, and we'll share it with everyone afterwards if you haven't seen it already. So next, I'm delighted to introduce Gábor Gyulai, who's going to focus in, as Khadija said, on one of the most challenging areas in the briefing, which is the determination of a child's nationality and identification of where a child would otherwise be stateless. So Gábor, you can switch on your camera. Gábor needs little introduction for many of you probably, but for those who don't know him, Gábor is joining us from Budapest, where he is Refugee Program Director at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. Hi, Gábor. He's also a trustee and president of ENS, and currently also a PhD student at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Among other areas, many areas of expertise, Gábor has carried out research into children's access to nationality in Hungary and refugee children's access to nationality nationality more generally. So Gábor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nina. Can you hear me properly? If I don't see any sign of alert, I will continue because I have very short time. So it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to see so many people participating from all over the world. And I would like to start with a very general statement that will be no news for anyone. Every child has a right to acquire a nationality. This is a basic human right embedded in several different human rights instruments. This is an obligation for all European states to observe. This is fine. We know we don't want stateless children in Europe. We know that statelessness for children means vulnerability, means a legal limbo, means psychological harm. It means lots of bad things that we don't want to happen to children in Europe. So there is a clear reason for which European states, nearly all European states, have safeguards in their national laws to prevent statelessness at birth. These safeguards say that if a child born on the territory of that country would otherwise be stateless, then the state must provide the nationality, its own nationality to that child, either immediately, that would be a generous standard, or later on after certain conditions and procedures as it is applied in some other countries. This is all fine, but how to do this in practice? And this is where birth registration comes into play. Birth registration is the first moment when a child born in Europe meets officially the state on the territory of which he or she was born. So this can be a crucial moment in making these safeguards effective. And this is where we get to my first statement, which describes anomaly or problems around this situation. So the link between birth registration and the nationality determination, which could be a good solution for preventing statelessness, is actually quite confusing, quite blurred, quite problematic in Europe. We still need additional data for research, but we already know from the briefing that Khadija has already presented and also previous ad hoc research that European countries follow very divergent practices. There is no general European approach to this question. For example, if you as a baby are born in France or in the UK, in Czechia or in the Ukraine, your nationality will not be entered on the birth certificate. So these issues will be completely separated. This may be a legally correct approach, as I will also defend later on in my recommendations, but also it may mean that there is no attention paid to determining the child nationality later either, and that can be problematic. In other European countries, state authorities will just simply enter the nationality of the parents automatically into the birth certificate of the child, exercising a sort of cultural projection, believing that, okay, in Europe, everybody transmits their nationality to their children automatically. This is the rule in basically all European states. So this must be the rule everywhere else in the world too. I can later on mention that this is not the case. So if you are born, for example, in Portugal or in Italy, you will automatically get your parents' nationality on your birth registration. Some other countries particularly pay attention to the mother. For example, in Sweden or Slovenia, as far as I know, these are the countries where the mother's nationality is automatically entered on the birth registry. This can be particularly problematic, as we know about countries like Somalia, like Iran, like Lebanon or Syria, where women are not allowed to pass on their nationality to their children. And yet there is another example like Hungary, where the state wouldn't like to bother with this. And if the child is not clearly Hungarian, they will just enter unknown nationality on the birth certificate. Once again, this may be a legally correct conclusion at the moment of the birth, but if it persists, as it happens in Hungary, for many, many, many years, sometimes even until adulthood, then this can be problematic. So we can see a fairly confusing picture. I think it's quite surprising that we haven't managed to get to any kind of common policy or any policy that would really pay attention to the best interest of the child. This brings us to my second statement, which says that Europe is not sufficiently prepared to identify those children who are otherwise stateless, and in the case of whom states are obliged to apply the safeguards that we already mentioned in the beginning of my presentation. So what happens to these children that I mentioned? Let's see a few concrete examples. Let's see first the typical example that covers the majority of childbirths in Europe. For example, a French couple has a child in France. This is a clear-cut case. The child will be a French national, and French authorities are perfectly equipped to establish this at first sight. There is no complication, no legal dilemma. What happens to immigrant parents? For example, a Chinese couple has a child in Spain. What happens? Spanish authorities cannot establish Chinese nationality because only China can do that under the logic of international rules and domestic rules for nationality law. But the parents can still go to the Chinese embassy in Madrid and register the child with the Chinese authorities and then obtain the necessary papers which will prove that the child is a Chinese national, and that will be entered into all his or her papers later on. Once again, there seems to be no problem. Unfortunately, there are other groups which may be much more at risk, and I have no time to explain all the situations, but I would like to highlight one of them, which is refugee children. Just to understand the dimension of the problem, current statistics of the UNHCR talk about nearly 7 million refugees living in Europe, in the Council of Europe area. So you can imagine that this concerns hundreds of thousands of refugee children born in Europe year by year. What happens to refugee parents? Can they go to the embassy to register the child? That would be very risky for them. Refugees are not simple migrants. They flee from something. They leave their home because they are afraid. They have a well-founded fear of being tortured, persecuted, enslaved, or harassed in very harsh ways. So if they go to their embassy, they may expose themselves at risk. They are fleeing from that state, so they cannot do that. Also, they would put at risk their own refugee status. For example, in Hungary, if a refugee voluntarily goes to the embassy of his home country, it's very likely that his refugee status will be immediately withdrawn. There may be some exceptions, but this is still a general danger. So obviously, they will not do that. What does this mean? The refugee child born in Europe will never have any paper proving his or her nationality, which doesn't mean that in theory she would not have a nationality, but still in practice this nationality will be completely dysfunctional. And let's see another concrete example for that, which brings me to my third statement, which says that many refugee children born in Europe cannot acquire any nationality within a reasonable time frame. Let's see probably the most extreme example. A girl is born to a Somali refugee couple in Europe. They have absolutely no perspective of ever returning to Somalia. Somalia is a failed state. There is a protracted refugee situation. There is a protracted security crisis going on for decades. This is something extremely unlikely to change in a month or in a year or two. So parents cannot return to Somalia to register the childbirth there. They cannot contact with the embassy of Somalia in Hungary, in Italy, in Germany, wherever in Europe, for reasons of security, which I already described, and also because Somalia does not have a network of diplomatic representations around the world. For being a failed state, it has very few of them. So finally, this girl will never have any kind of official manifestation of her nationality in the eyes of the Somali state. So while in nationality law, normally you are not required to have a genuine link to your country of nationality, you can be perfectly an Italian citizen, having been born in Argentina and never ever entered Italy and not speaking a word of Italian. But also I would like to remind those who listen to us to the definition of statelessness in international law, which says that a stateless person is somebody who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law. Here we have two interesting words, the considered and the operation, which still shows that the state still has to have some sort of an active attitude. At least he has to know about the person who is his national, or has to be ready to kind of do something for that person, be it consular protection, be it issuing documents, be it providing any sort of basic rights. So this is a really blurred, swampy border area of nationality law, and I would not contend that all refugee children are stateless who are born in Europe. It's on the opposite. Most of them do have a nationality, but based on an individualized assessment that considers the best interest of the child and every child's real right to obtain a nationality, we may conclude that cases like the Somali girl that I have just described may fulfill the definition for statelessness, especially if their situation persists for a couple of years. And if we consider them as stateless, that means that European states' obligation to provide their nationality to these children also kicks in. This is what we are not prepared for. Because in reality, these children who are born in Europe, what happens is either states put fake nationality into their birth registration. Let's imagine that a Somali mother has a child in Europe. States who put automatically the mother's nationality, they disregard the fact that Somalia does not allow mothers to pass on their nationality to their children, or the same with Syria. Or they put unknown nationality, or they just don't make any effort to clarify this nationality, and these children may arrive at the age of school or even at adulthood without their nationality have ever been clarified. And some of them, for this reason, may not have access to the nationality of the country they were born in, and thus to European citizenship, where EU competency may also kick in. And after these three problems, let me just conclude with 4 short recommendations, especially benefiting from the fact that we have a member of the European Parliament on this virtual panel as well. So I would like to recommend that we need European standards. There is too much confusion about these issues. The Council of Europe and the European Union should work together to find out how these things could be done better in Europe. And my 4th recommendation would be, first of all, birth registration and nationality determination should be conceptually separated. Birth registry officers or doctors who register birth, they are not nationality law experts. They should never be required to deliver this task. Plus, this is something, this cannot be done in a second. Sometimes you need weeks, months, or even years to find out the nationality status of a child. Second, we must have, instead of a doctor or a register determining nationality, a competent authority that is specialized, has a mandate, has the knowledge, has access to information, and has the obligation to ex officio, so on its own initiative, determine a child's nationality if a child is found to be at risk of statelessness. Currently, we don't really see any good practice in this respect in Europe, so we should really work towards this end. And the 3rd recommendation is that in all these endeavors, we have to pay attention to certain populations at risk. Khadija has already mentioned the Roma, who live in informal settlements, or irregular migrants, or just refugees, as I mentioned. This would cover cooperation between state authorities and NGOs working with these particular populations, and of course, specialized training. And finally, as you could hear from my very short intervention, there is a lot of blurred issues around the nationality of refugee children. No international organization has ever issued a guidance on that. There is no academic literature on that. So what we need to do as a next step, and this recommendation goes particularly to the UNHCR, is to make the experts meet and find out what the standards should be. We need more guidance. We have to tell states, we have to tell NGOs and other actors what are those standards that will ensure every refugee child's right to acquire a nationality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You did a great job of fitting everything into a short space of time. That was a really fascinating delve into a particularly challenging area. Excuse me, and thank you for your recommendations for a way forward as well. Building on this now, we're going to turn to how we can address the issues highlighted in the briefing and highlighted by our speakers today. I want to briefly point you in the direction of the 4 action areas that we outline in the briefing, where we think urgent attention is needed from national governments, regional institutions, and other key stakeholders to address the barriers to birth registration and prevent statelessness, ensuring every child can acquire a nationality. So very briefly, you can see them on your screen now. The first is about access to immediate free birth registration and certification for all children, regardless of parent status, documentation, or identity. And in the briefing, we've set out some areas for action under this particular area, including flexibility in documentation requirements, including capacity building for frontline officials, improved access or unrestricted access to healthcare and civil registration, etc. The second area that Khadija mentioned already is around removing mandatory reporting requirements that might deter people from accessing healthcare or civil registration if they have a regular resident status in the country, for example. The third area is improving procedures to determine the child's nationality and identifying where they would otherwise be stateless, which we've just heard from Gábor on. And the fourth area is around data collection and improving local, national and regional data on birth registration, and particularly to improve the disaggregation of data, to identify and better inform a response to some of these groups of children at particular risk. So with this in mind, and to tell us a bit more about the role of regional institutions, European institutions, and in particular the European Parliament and Children's Rights Intergroup, and how we can galvanise action in these areas, I'm really delighted to welcome and introduce our final speaker, Saskia Bricmont, MEP. Saskia, you can switch on your camera. Saskia is the co-chair of the Children's Rights Intergroup. She's an MEP from the Belgian Ecolo Party and a member of the Green Group in the European Parliament. As well as co-chairing the Intergroup, Saskia also sits on the Libe and International Trade Committees and is an active advocate on many of these issues. And we're really grateful to have her with us today. So Saskia, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here and to hear all the recommendations you've been doing in the work you were doing on this very important issue. And as you may know, the European Parliament already has taken many pledges, resolutions to end this problematic and to end statelessness. In a resolution from 2018, also in order to comply, simply comply with our international obligations, and considering this is a fundamental right of the people. The latest resolution that we adopted was end of the year, in November, for the 30th anniversary of the UN Convention on Children's Rights, where we explicitly mentioned the promotion of universal access to birth registration and the child right to acquire nationality with a view of ending statelessness. So that's for now. That's what we have as statements for now. This is of course not enough because we have, it has been said, and I say it again, international obligations to ensure every child has their birth registered and is able to acquire a nationality. We have also obligations under the Statelessness conventions. And it has been said, there are unfortunately still many barriers and concrete operational barriers. Even if we have laws in several member states, there are practical barriers to end statelessness. And we know that this leads to the violation of basic rights and of basic needs, such as access to social security, health, housing, employment, education, and so on. Still, the number is very important to mention also. 500,000 people only in the European Union is concerned by this situation. So different measures exist and the recommendations are on the table. And the tool provided by the European Network on Statelessness, this index, is very interesting when you go through it, because it shows all the good and bad practices in our member states. And I was also surprised, even though I knew some situations of the situation in my own country, in Belgium, where, for instance, and this is not the first time I heard that, I've had testimonies that people just fear to go register their child because they fear to be reported to the immigration authorities, and this is just not something we can live with. So what can be done to answer also Gábor's recommendation and appeal is to work on all this work you have been doing to work on a common ground, common standards at the EU level, and maybe draft a proposal that would be the best way of working, and that this recommendation, this text could be submitted to the national parliaments, for instance, in order to harmonize and to have a real EU approach to concretely, effectively fight against statelessness. And this is particularly urgent. I think we could make it a priority in this crisis context, because we know that being deprived of nationality, being stateless, makes it even more difficult for people to access basic needs, basic help, when it comes to health, food, accommodation, access to housing, and so on. So I think we should work on this legal framework, but also address this issue when it comes to the recovery plans at national and European level. So we are discussing this next week in the plenary session. I really think that we need to address this issue when it comes to tackling and bringing answers, responses to particular vulnerable groups. This is a vulnerable group that needs to be mentioned explicitly in the recovery plans. And this is, for instance, also why several member states, such as Portugal and several groups, have been appealing, and the Greens also, for the regularization of undocumented people, especially in this period of crisis. Maybe that Italy will follow, I hope so. And in my country, for the moment, it's not on the table, although many NGOs and civil society has been asking for this. So there is a trend, there is a movement. We need to push this and to all work together to make it happen. There is another injustice to me, which is, besides the situation of children in migration that Gábor has been talking about, it is also the decisions to deprive people of citizenship for reasons of, for instance, terrorism, which also impacts children. And children should never be accountable for the acts of their parents. They should be protected. And this shouldn't be linked to the status and the situation of their parents. This is also something we need to address. So today, urgent action is needed in general when it comes to statelessness. Work on European common standards to identify and protect stateless people, to ensure that they can access, even during the procedures, to social and economic rights, to fight against discrimination, also in more vulnerable groups. It has been said, for instance, the Roma people. When it comes to children's rights, to ensure the right for every child to be granted a nationality if born in Europe. This is essential. And also the participation. This is something very important to me, to make those people participate in the decisions we take, because again, people living in a constant fear to be arrested, even if they bring their kids to school, for example. They fear to cross and to run into public authorities, into the police, just because they are undocumented and they fear for their life on a daily basis. We cannot live with that. We cannot allow that. And for children, we take the recommendations. All children must be registered immediately upon birth, regardless of the residence or documentation status of their parents and family members. The need for documentary proof of birth to be automatically delivered. This is also essential. The determination of child's nationality where the child may otherwise be stateless. And of course, no mandatory reporting requirements for public officials that could discourage migrant parents from approaching birth registration authorities. And I will communicate this immediately to my federal colleagues so they can also work on these issues. Last but not least, also the possibility to have late birth registration assured. This is also essential. So what else can be done at European level? We have several discussions for the moment and opening on different legal texts, legal frameworks. The EU Pact on Migration is one, so we can there make sure that the issue of statelessness is addressed. We need also to work on the possibility to include in conditionality clauses in development and humanitarian aid in this context, especially of COVID crisis. So to include the possibility for undocumented children to create a special section in the civil records to register the birth. So it's very important for children born, for instance, in refugee camps and where Gábor said it, where the mothers are not allowed by law to pass their nationality to their children. We also have a third possibility to work around the Roma strategy, which is now under discussion. So this is also an important step where we need to address statelessness. And of course, all the work that we are now doing with the European Commission and waiting for the European Commission to deliver the EU strategy on children's rights. We had a meeting yesterday with the intergroup on children's rights from the European Parliament with different NGO and stakeholders and representatives of the European Commission that ensured us that it will be a very comprehensive strategy, including issues related to the most vulnerable people, vulnerable children, including also the issue of undocumented children and statelessness. So we will be very attentive to this and to make sure it is included as a global approach in this EU child rights strategy. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Saskia. That was a really useful overview of some of the ways that we can galvanize action to address these issues and some concrete ideas for where these issues could be integrated and mainstreamed into ongoing debates, which is really useful. We have a few minutes now for questions. There have been a few questions coming through on the chat. We're not going to be able to answer them all, but we'll do our best to get back to those of you individually who've asked questions. I've collated a few for each speaker, so I'm just going to give each speaker maybe 2 minutes to answer and say a couple of closing remarks. So I'll start with Khadija. Khadija, we've had a question about the possibility to include Montenegro in the index and reports, and we've also had a question about recommendations during the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to birth registration and some of the particular issues that might be affecting stateless people in that regard. And that question came from the Dominican Republic. It's great to have you with us this morning. And there was also a question about how many children might be affected. So just very briefly, if you want to pick any of those and come in for a couple of minutes on any final points, that would be great. Thanks, Khadija.
All your questions this morning. So quickly on the possibility of including Montenegro, we started off the index with, I think, how many countries was it, Nina? And we've gradually increased the number of countries every year. So this year we're adding 3 new countries, and we do that kind of incrementally based on making sure that we can, because we update the index on an annual basis. So there's kind of reanalysis every year of new information, as well as analysis of new countries every year. And we add new countries based on where we have members and country experts in our network, and where there's interest as well within our membership to get involved in the index and to add a new country profile. And so hopefully at some point in the future, we might be able to add Montenegro as a country if there's interest and kind of the expertise within our network. But it's done on a country by country basis, depending on kind of the expertise and interest available within our network. But thank you, and great to hear that there is interest to see a profile on Montenegro. And hopefully in the future there's a possibility of having one. And then thanks for the question in relation to COVID-19. And yes, actually we have seen from a survey of our members that we did, we found that there were some issues in relation to birth registration as a result of the pandemic. So we were seeing that some consular or civil registry offices were being closed. And so as a result, parents aren't able to currently, in some countries, register the births of their children. And so you can find out more about that in the policy, but we're recommending that action needs to be taken to make sure that children born in Europe during the crisis can still acquire a nationality. And as part of that, there needs to be birth registration and certification possible, either, if not now, as soon as possible, to rectify where the child hasn't had their birth registered. So there is an impact in some countries, and you can read more about that in the policy, and we can maybe link to that in the chat. But yeah, thank you for that.
I'm going to round you up there because I need to go to Gábor and Saskia too, and we've just got 10 minutes left. So Gábor, we've had quite a few technical questions coming in for you. I'm not going to have time, unfortunately, to put them all to you, but some questions about how to determine whether a child is otherwise stateless, some questions about how to improve the approach of national authorities to refugee status determination and nationality. So these are all things that maybe we can try and respond to people individually to those particular questions, but you're getting a lot of technical interest in your input, Gábor. I'm going to put one question to you, and if you could answer in 2 or 3 minutes. And there's a question coming about EU competency. So given that the best interest of the child is a key principle of the EU rights strategy, how can we get improving birth registration better onto the EU agenda, was a kind of specific question. But maybe I'm going to put a question about EU action to Saskia in a moment, but perhaps you could just say 2 or 3 words about EU competency in this area, because it does come up often in debates around nationality and statelessness. So thank you, Gábor.
Thank you very much for it. This is a very useful question, and I'm happy you asked it, because usually there is a general understanding that the EU has nothing to do with nationality laws and statelessness, because nationality is one of the classic areas of member state competence. It's really intimately the domaine réservé of states. But this is not really the case anymore. As we have seen, there are lots of infiltration of international human rights standards into nationality law in the last century. But also there are good arguments to put forward if we want to argue that even though nationality as such is not under the scope of EU law, but the prevention of statelessness in case of children born in the EU is. And one of them, as you mentioned, is the child rights structure, for example, in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. There are lots of references we can use there: the right to private life and the obligation to interpret those rights in light of the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights from the Council of Europe structure, which has positive references about the access to nationality as part of one's social identity and then right to private life. So there are lots of links, indirect links. Also, if you look at the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice of the European Union, you will find several judgments that state that when member states deal with nationality issues, they should do that with due regard to community law. So if there was no EU standard whatsoever, the Court of Justice would have never ruled in these cases. And there are also concrete cases of the Court of Justice which we can look at. So this is a very narrow path, but I think there are good arguments to state that, especially bringing in the child rights perspective. I actually wrote a paper on that, and I will just share after we finish the link on the chat.
Perfect. Thank you, Gábor. A succinct answer to a tricky question, but thank you. I'm going to now put the final question to Saskia before we round up. We've had quite a few questions come through, Saskia. Somebody asking, how to galvanize state action on this. That was a question from the Netherlands saying, the action is difficult to we're not seeing concrete action at national level. There was another question, as I mentioned before, about the child rights strategy, but the one that I want to put you in our last 3 minutes, is just, you've really successfully outlined and usefully outlined how we can better mainstream statelessness in different EU agendas. But given that it's such a cross-cutting issue, is it now time for a dedicated resolution on childhood statelessness? So what are your thoughts on that, Saskia?
Thank you for the questions, and I also see in the chat there's a lot of enthusiasm about this exchanges. First of all, I fully agree with Gábor. I think there are opportunities in the EU legislation and regulations that we can take to mainstream the issue. And so I directly come to the last question. Should we go for a dedicated resolution? I personally think that we should, but at the European Parliament level, it's always about compromise and negotiation. So strategically, it's to see what is better, to work specifically on a resolution on this issue, and we might not end up with a global agreement among political groups, and then the debate ends there, or try to mainstream the issue and get always in every text, also the ones that I mentioned before, this issue repeated in every area of legislation and in every resolution that we work on at EU level. I think mainstreaming for this topic is very important, because the risk for a specific resolution would be, well, we have international obligations and member states have to comply with these obligations, but that concretely, on the ground, in the practice, we do not see the national legislations evolve. This doesn't mean that we don't need to have action and to have maybe campaigns and maybe to go further in this topic and try to engage the more MEPs possible in this campaigning possibility. Because I think among the different political groups we can find allies on this issue. But as the material now exists also through the index, again, I repeat it, maybe it would be interesting to have a proposal for a common legal framework with the minimum standards that we want to push through, and to really deliver this paper to the national parliaments and governments, and to try to push it in the national laws. That could be a possibility. I'm open to discuss it with the ones that would like to go further on this. And again, I don't close the door to a global resolution, but I think we really need to be strategic on this kind of issues that might be politically sensitive, also when it comes, for instance, to the issue of deprivation of nationality in case of terrorism and other issues. So it's not an easy issue to tackle. I also saw in the chat, if I may, the issue raised, very important issue raised on unaccompanied minors, and I didn't talk about it because Gábor also talked about migration, but of course this is also a very crucial issue, also to fight against all the missing children and children going missing in Europe, and then fall under human trafficking and bad hands. So there are several issues at stake here: access to basic needs, socioeconomic rights, but it's, I think, also a very crucial security issue for Europe to work on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to rush you, but we have just 2 minutes left. So I just want to take those 2 minutes to thank all of our speakers for taking the time to share your insights and expertise today. Thank you to all of the 270, I think we reached, attendees who joined us today from all around the world. I saw people from the Philippines to Egypt to the Dominican Republic, Colombia, and every corner of Europe, all the way to Georgia, coming up in the chat. So it's fantastic. Thank you for your interest and commitment to the issue at a time when we know that many groups of people, and many of you personally and professionally are facing unprecedented challenges. And today's webinar was especially important to us at ENS and our members, because as many of you know, we were meant to be in Alicante today, hosting a major regional conference with our Spanish member Fundación Tepaim and many others on the protection gaps facing stateless people in Europe. It wasn't possible for us all to come together in Alicante this week, but we fully intend to reschedule the conference as soon as it's safe and feasible to do so. In the meantime, our work continues to ensure that people affected by statelessness are part of the debate and response to the pandemic, and look out for more from us and our members in coming months. As for the Statelessness Index, we'll be adding, as Khadija said, 3 new countries this year to the index, updating the data for the existing countries, and our next thematic briefing, which will hopefully be out towards the end of the year or early next year, will focus on statelessness determination procedures and protection status in Europe. In the meantime, as promised, we'll share the presentations and the recording from today, and look forward to working with all of you towards our shared goal of ending childhood statelessness. Have a great day or evening, wherever you are. Stay safe and goodbye.